Conservation Cafe. I'm Eliza Cava, Director of Conservation at Audubon Naturalist Society. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm very excited to have with us Mariana del Valle Prieto Cervantes, Director of Strategic Initiatives at GreenLatinos. And I'll introduce her a bit, and then later on you will hear more from her as she introduces herself. Mariana has committed her life to help advocate for the Latinx community in the environmental movement. She's an immigrant from Mexico and raised in California's Central Coast, where she lives now, on the Monterey Bay, which she told me how much she loves. And she's a mother of two. She's always been near the ocean. She worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. She has government and local policy experience, campaign experience. And here at GreenLatinos, she focuses on strategic planning for organizational initiatives on water, ocean, coastal access priorities. And she's leading now this campaign that we're going to hear about tonight, America the Beautiful for All. And I asked her to come immediately the day I received an email from her inviting us to learn more about the America the Beautiful for All campaign, because I thought this is great. You know, it's a nationwide campaign and ANS really does work at the local level, but we know that everything we're doing at the local level influences and is supported by these national campaigns. And it marries together two of our biggest priorities in the conservation program at ANS, which are biodiversity and habitat protection and human health and access to nature. So you'll learn a lot more about the campaign itself, but let me just say, I just love the way its goals are so twinned powerfully together. And thank you, Mariana, for leading it. So ANS, which will be called Audubon Naturalist Society, we expect for like 25 more hours before we change our name in our annual meeting tomorrow night. So this is the last Conservation Cafe. Well, I will introduce us with this name, although our mission and vision will be the same. And we seek to create a larger and more diverse community of people who treasure the natural world and work to preserve it. That's our vision. And Conservation Cafe is part and parcel of achieving that vision through our mission, which includes helping people appreciate, understand, protect their natural environment through things that include education and advocacy, which is what tonight is all about. I will turn it over to Mariana with many, many thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining, especially on I don't even know what day it is, Wednesday evening, I believe. Yes, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you for the introduction, Alyssa. Thank you for all that are joining us today. A little bit about myself, Mariana del Valle Prieto Cervantes, ella, she, hers. I am, as Alyssa mentioned, here in the Monterey Bay area, which is occupied Ohlone land. And I have dos pollitos. I'm a proud mother of two, a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old. And as mentioned, I work with GreenLatinos, which is an active comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latina, environmental and conservation leaders, really emboldened by the power and wisdom of our culture, united to demand equity and dismantle racism, and research to win our political, economic, and environmental justice battles, and driven to secure our political, economic, and environmental liberation. So that's our mission there. Our vision is really to envision a healthy and equitable society where communities of color are liberated, free to breathe fresh air, drink pure water, access clean transportation, and enjoy our majestic public lands, water, and ocean. So that tells you a little bit about us, our policy priorities, our public land and ocean, water equity, climate justice and clean air, and sustainable communities, which really embody clean transportation and a just transition to clean energy. I am really lucky and fortunate to lead on our water equity and ocean program, but I also do our strategic planning for the organization. And we are a mighty small team of 13, but growing to 15, 17. And one of the many amazing campaigns and really strategic goals that we have is in and around 30 by 30 and Justice 40. And so I think the America the Beautiful for All Coalition is one of those ways that we really saw us making sure that we are really conserving at least 30% of land and water by 2030, and also thinking about how we can ensure that environmental justice, equitable access, and public health are embodied within those goals. As many of you may or may not know, the Biden administration put forward a America the Beautiful initiative. And that initiative really has some key principles to it. One is pursuing a collaboration and inclusive approach to conservation. The other is conserving America's lands, waters for benefit of all people. That is the 30 by 30 goal. Supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts, so really bringing it down to the local level. Honoring tribal sovereignty and supporting the priorities of tribal nations. Pursuing conservation and restoration approaches that create jobs and support healthy communities. Honoring private property rights and supporting the voluntary stewardship of efforts of private landowners, and using science as a guide and building on existing tools and strategies with an emphasis on flexibility and adaptive approaches. So when this came out back in 2021, May of 2021, I think a lot of environmental organizations, from public lands to water to ocean, to any other really perspective that works on these efforts, was really excited to see this. And what we ended up seeing a lot of, and I think I say all of this to kind of give you a journey of how we got to America the Beautiful for All Coalition. What we started to see is, and the same thing was happening with any big initiative put forward, and that is that people in different perspectives were siloed. Public lands was working on their campaigns, ocean is working on their campaigns, water is working on their campaigns, and nobody was really talking to each other. And if they were talking to each other, there was a stark difference in who was at the table, and it was mostly the same players, and really not as inclusive as we wanted it to be, in ensuring that historically intentionally overlooked communities were highlighted and were brought to the table. So when we realized that, we put our heads together, both GreenLatinos, the Wilderness Society, and Children's Environmental Health Network, to really create a space that we initially called Table of Tables, bringing together all of the different tables, all of the different perspectives, and pulling up more chairs, really meaning making sure that we are centering and uplifting those communities that have been historically, intentionally not included in some of these conservation efforts. So that's the premise and the idea behind America the Beautiful for All Coalition. We really wanted to unite each other under a shared agenda and build shared power to achieve America the Beautiful goals by 2030. And so what are those goals? Those goals are, number one, conserve at least 30% of land, water, and ocean by 2030. And we do say at least because there is a lot of goals out there that really want to meet nature needs half global conservation efforts through 2050. So 50 by 50 is also something that is on the table. But to avoid massive species loss, as we already are seeing, secure equitable access to nature's benefits, and then prevent and repair the impact of the climate crisis for all communities. And the part that really excites me is the equitable access to nature's benefits. As I mentioned, and as Alyssa mentioned, I am a proud immigrant of Mexico. I was born in Mexico and migrated here with my family when I was 8 years old. I lived right next to a marine protected area for most of my life and didn't really have that access until later on in life, mainly because of socioeconomic disparities. We were, just arriving here, didn't know those spaces were for us, didn't know that there was no real representation there. And then we didn't really have a car to kind of get around to access those beaches and those point areas. And living here, knowing what I know now and how special this space is, and knowing how many people come from all over the world to visit us, there's still disparities within even this area of who gets coastal access and who has to go under a freeway to access the Monterey Bay. So that's goal number one. Goal number two is to implement a Justice 40 metric for the America the Beautiful initiative to really ensure that at least 40% of investments are made in communities of color, in frontline communities that have historically seen little to no investment in conservation and equitable access to nature. So that is goal number two for us. And that's really what it's our North Star in how we want to make sure that this coalition comes forward and this campaign comes forward. So our vision statement for that is to really, by uniting land, freshwater, and ocean advocates from across the country, this coalition will design a drive forward, a shared policy agenda, focus on its two twin goals that I just mentioned, that motivates urgent action by the Biden administration and other decision makers while building long-term political power. And so I kind of want to just emphasize that other because our goal is 2030. And we know that the political landscape is going to look different moving forward, unfortunately. So that is something that we are thinking about and really looking towards the future for. And that the political power necessary to accomplish these two twin goals rests entirely on our ability to shift the power from the normal day-to-day players that don't really embody what America looks like, grow and cultivate a united environmental community that truly represents America. So that is our vision statement there, and took many, many meetings and a couple of frustrating calls to really get there. And I say frustrating because it was a lot of growing and a lot of learning on the backbone team that was kind of the initial thinkers of this. And so what does it mean to really shift power, build community, and change the movement? And so our objectives here is to build and nurture an inclusive, representative, action-orientated, and focused coalition to achieve our two primary goals. So a lot of different coalitions and spaces sometimes can become information sharing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we really wanted to make sure that if we were coming together, if we were going to ensure that we have everyone's perspective, that we made this coalition very action focused and ready to start to think about some of the solutions here. And on top of that, if we wanted to center those organizations that represented some of the historically overlooked communities in communities of color, frontline communities, we knew that resources in our initial conversations was a big thing. So resources and capacity. So one of the things that we are as a coalition is a need-based coalition. And so we are supporting capacity by increasing, by having what we call the community support fund, and hopefully by being able to give really substantial, modest, at the moment because we're still fundraising, stipends to these organizations that are non-legacy organizations, as we call them, would really increase their impact, their capacity, and their influence in our policy agenda and in the coalition overall. And then our third objective was to make 30 by 30 America the Beautiful more relevant to communities willing to fight for the coalition's goals by equipping member organizations with the communication resources and support that they need across their spectrum of audiences. So really thinking forward and making sure that we have some of those resources to provide our organizations or that are participating with. So again, just to kind of summarize a little bit of this is, this coalition is uniting different tables, different perspective, different working groups together to craft some of the policy proposals to achieve 30 by 30 and the Beautiful Initiative goals that used to be in silos. We want to expand the table, so pull up more chairs to ensure that we are getting different perspectives, not just from different backgrounds and perspectives, but geography as well, thinking about Alaska and the territories as part of the solution. Making sure that we are amplifying and uplifting historically and deliberately overlooked communities and making sure that they are in those leadership roles, and incentivizing participation of leaders with our need half or supporting funding fund there. And so, like I mentioned, this coalition has those two twin goals, and our timeline really looks like making sure as we speak, we have put together some of our working groups, we have a steering committee, and we are working towards shared measures, we are working towards releasing and putting together a policy agenda that we will be releasing on January 27, 2023, which would be the second anniversary of when the Biden administration put forward the America the Beautiful initiative. And again, our goal is really 2030. And what does that mean if the political landscape is different? And really to start to think about some of the ways that we can position ourselves to push forward a 50 by 50 goal to really meet nature's needs half. So that's our timeline, a little bit of our structure there. We have our steering committee, we have priority projects and campaigns, working group, which will really look at all of the different campaigns that are happening when it comes to ocean, wildlife, public lands, urban parks and green spaces, and say this one's prime and can be something that that we can move forward as a whole group and essentially singing from the same sheet of music. And if we do that, it builds power, especially if decision makers in the administration is listening, not just from public lands, if it's a public land monument, but they're listening from a wide spectrum of different stakeholders. And a little bit about our steering committee, as I mentioned, really wanting to amplify the different perspectives. So we have an ocean perspective, we have some different, public health perspective with our co-chair, Ensei, who's part of the Children's Environmental Health Network. GreenLatinos is also co-chair of this coalition. And then we have indigenous leaders like John E. Echohawk. We have some leaders from Hawaii, like Kevin Chang with KUA. We have a science perspective with IUCN, Outdoor Afro, Next 100 Coalition. And then we also have NDN Collective, another indigenous leader there, a freshwater perspective with the River Network, the Bears Intertribal Bears Coalition, Katie Cuffling, who's also the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environment, so more of that public health perspective. So really thinking about those different perspectives there. And then our coalition work group leadership, really, again, thinking about different perspectives, different folks that may have different geographical areas and needs there. So we thought about that for our work group. And then the backbone team consists, as I mentioned, of GreenLatinos, Children's Environmental Health Network, and the Wilderness Society. And with that, I think I can take any questions.
That was a great overview of the campaign, Mariana. Thank you so much. I kept wondering, like, I want to know who's involved. I want to know the phone book so that I can keep up. So we're going to take questions from the audience. And again, you can use the Q&A, but I encourage you to just raise your hand. And then I'll give you a minute to turn on both your video and your audio so that we can see and hear you. But I will also, while we're waiting for hands, I have questions. So some of my questions include, like, can you give us, I know I asked you for an example in the Chesapeake region, which it's fine, I have one of those. But I was wondering if you could give us like a really concrete example of what this looks like. What would success look like for a place or for a community? Well, it could be Monterey Bay, but is there, or any other place where you've been thinking about, like when you describe that vision to a community on the ground to get them involved, what's going to change?
Yeah, and I think some of those are, campaigns that are already happening, have been happening for a really long time, and unfortunately don't get the same attention as other campaigns, right? So one of the campaigns that GreenLatinos has been leading on for many, many years now, and along with community members, is Cast and Range, and that is in El Paso, which we know El Paso has a high population of Latino communities. They have seen mass shootings, they have seen some atrocities there, and Cast and Range would be a space for folks to be able to connect with nature that is not 3 hours away. It's not, it's not Yosemite or, one of those locations, and it really is integrated within the community already. So a protection like Cast and Range would be some of our goals when it comes to ensuring that not only are we protecting and moving towards that 30 by 30 goal of protecting land, water, and ocean, but are also thinking about the community that it could potentially impact in a positive way, and bring some of that nature closer to home for folks to have equitable access to it. I think it's also thinking about, for example, urban parks and green spaces, thinking about our urban areas. And I think when we think about 30 by 30 or protecting lands, waters, and ocean, we think about massive, nature areas. But, can we think about that as looking towards an urban space and providing a park in that area, providing more green, more trees in those urban spaces, I think is also part of that conversation to ensure that there is a healthy environment for the folks that are in those spaces.
I have a follow-up question on that, but I also have Hodumbia who wants to talk. So I'm going to promote Joe to panelist. And it may take her just a moment to come on in with her video and audio so she can ask. But maybe while she's doing that, I'll ask you my follow-up question and then she can be next. So my follow-up question is about the idea of wilderness. When I think about the 30 by 30 campaign, before I knew about the America the Beautiful for All initiative, I often thought, well, we must be talking about huge ocean protected sanctuaries, big offshore coastal areas. We must be talking about big areas adjacent to national forests and other federal lands that are far away from where most people live, because the idea of getting to 30%, you want big chunks of land, which makes me think of the wilderness idea. And I love traveling to the wilderness. I'm mentally pretty bought into the idea that, like, it's better to be in nature by myself without other people. I'm more rugged that way, and I like it. But I also really like walking outside my door and going to nature and recognizing that we all need nature so much that we need it really close to us. So how do you, you explained it in deep, in this example, but do you get pushback from people who say, when you're talking about urban nature and you're talking about making it accessible, that's counter to the goals of getting this much land for 30 by 30? And how do you respond to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is pushback just in general within the community on, what is 30 by 30? What is conservation? How do you define that? What is conserved? Even in the marine spaces, right? A lot of folks, when we're thinking about marine protected areas, we think about these faraway places that are not very accessible unless you're on a boat, and going really far away from land. But how do we ensure that, those spaces are more accessible? Even with marine protected area, a lot of the community is in the ocean community is highly and fully protected marine areas. Is the way to go, is what counts in this 30 by 30. And that's, it sounds great in science perspective, but then if we think about the indigenous perspective, and a lot of our indigenous partners have said, no, that's not the way to go, because we use that space, we use those spaces. That's how we get our food. That's where we have ceremony. And if those are highly and fully protected, they are not going to be accessible for my community. So I think there is, there's definitely a conversation happening around that within the conservation community. As far as the coalition goes, I think we're building at the speed of trust, building those relationships, because we know that we have a lot of different perspectives. And so right now we're working on measurable outcomes, right? And what does that mean? And, how do we define conservation, 30 by 30, and what counts, and this, and that. And so we're having those conversations right now, and those are going to come up. And we know that there's going to be touching points and pinch points, but we're choosing to go the 80%, 20% of, can we agree on 80% of this? And then the rest, everybody can kind of do their own thing, but this 80% is what's really going to move the needle. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it, how we're mitigating it. Have we seen those pinch points yet? Not yet, but I know they're coming.
Thank you. Okay, Josefina, your turn. And thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you. I think that, you began on the conversation, with your questions and the follow-ups. And it is, on the 30 by 30. And so what does it mean, the protection? There is this very strong movement about, the empty lawns in front of the homes in America that corresponds to a significant percentage of, reclaimable land for purposes of biodiversity. Yes. And so I think that when we are talking about, preserving the different areas, it is preserving for what? Preserving for biodiversity, preserving for clean air, preserving for good spaces. So as you were saying, probably it's not exclusively going into these isolated, distant, pristine places, but there is also possibly, as part of the conversation that you say that the coalition is having, it is, how do we make it for all? Yes. How do we look for doing landscaping whereby, the roads have trees, on the walk areas, that, there are trees or gardens in the parking spaces, that the highways can have, means to really enjoy, the greenery as we go along, because it is ultimately in terms of the biodiversity. So I don't know whether the group that the Urban Parks and Green Spaces Workshop, it is sort of the group that sort of looks into this area particularly. And I'm looking at it from, the place where I'm sitting. I'm in like Northern Virginia. We don't have big national parks. We have our parks that, we have to preserve and we have to take care of. But I'm trying to reconcile sitting in my corner with the big vision, which please by all means carry it on. Yes, but then I don't feel my connection on that. So it would be great if you can sort of help me to navigate that dichotomy that I'm having. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, right, and I'm glad that resonated with you, that this 30 by 30 goal has different things that we want to achieve there. We want to secure equitable access to nature's benefits, right? And so when we walk out and we, are you know, within nature, or if we go to a national park and are isolated in nature, we know that those have really good health benefits, right? They, you know, they are mentally and physically well-being, solace, peacefulness, and even spiritually, it can be really beneficial for humans to be in nature. And when it comes to to knowing that not everyone has those benefits, right? And you know, there is a nature gap between, in a huge disparity with communities of color, low-income communities, and rural communities. And so really thinking about that, thinking about how we prevent and repair the impacts of the climate crisis, because we're seeing those in many different ways, from flooding to wildfires. And so how do we think about really addressing those different issues when we're thinking about conserving and having access and more nature in our spaces? So yeah, urban parks and green spaces is one of those working groups that is really thinking about that when it comes to cities and you know, maybe even rural areas. How do we get those nature's benefits and mitigate the climate crisis, as we're going to see more and more of in those areas? So I don't know, I don't think I have an answer to your question, but I know that that's something that we're thinking about as well. And, you know, I really loved your ideas of more trees and passages as we're driving along in the freeways, and you know, those types of examples, and how do we make that happen? And you know, there is like green infrastructure. I also come with a water background, and that's something that we're thinking about a lot of, especially when it comes to flooding. We need more green infrastructure in order to help mitigate those things. And what is green infrastructure? It really is providing more green spaces so that the water can naturally absorb into the ground, as opposed to going through gray infrastructure into pipelines.
Rain gardens, yes, lots of rain gardens, yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Appreciate it.
I don't know what I did there, but thank you so much, Joe. Great to see you. By the way, everyone, Josefina Dumbia has been on our Naturally Latinos Conference Planning Committee for the last 2 years, and may have a new relationship to ANS soon, but I suppose we won't know for sure until tomorrow. Stand by on that. So I wanted to show, I was talking with Mariana before tonight, and was talking about asking her to localize again what this looks like, similar to, you know, what are the ideas? What does this mean? And the example, she is obviously from the West Coast and didn't have any examples in our area directly, but I thought I would share with you all. You know, people may have been to Patapsco Valley State Park, Cunningham Falls State Park, Greenbrier State Park. The state parks in the Maryland State Parks inventory, right near where many of us live, get packed on summer weekends. And I'm going to show you, if you follow, I follow this Twitter feed, and because honestly, because I think it's so interesting what the Maryland State Park System has been doing. They routinely they fill. So the parks fill up for the parking areas where there's a huge line. Sometimes an hour after they open, the parks are completely full, and the metric they use is by the parking area. And so they tweet in English and in Spanish, sorry, Greenbrier State Park is full and no more people may enter. Lo sentimos, Greenbrier State Park está lleno y no puede entrar nadie más. And they've been doing this for a couple of years. They're partnering with groups like Corazon Latino and Chesapeake Conservancy to bring in advice and consulting, and actually bilingual summer rangers to have more Spanish-speaking staff in the parks. Because one of the things that they've experienced, and that you can see if you go visit, is that there's huge Latino populations, obviously, in the DC area and in Maryland. And people love to use the parks. Every weekend there's cookouts, there's swimming, there's fishing, big family groups. And this is something we've spoken about a lot with other speakers and at our conferences, that many parks are not set up for the way that Latino families want to use them, which is in large groups for a long period of time, spending the whole day gathered together. And so if you need to bring 5 cars for your whole family, you know, the crowding is a big problem. And the picnic tables might be sort of set out at intervals, but you want them together so that you can have your reunion. So the state parks are recognizing this, and they're working on dealing with it, both with interpretation, including around rules and regulations around fishing, for example, making sure people understand legal fishing requirements and make sure they get their licenses, and without chasing them down with uniformed police, which scares people out of parks when they're not doing anything particularly bad. And so they're just working really, really hard on this. This is not the same thing as conserving more land, but it is a recognition that these lands are in huge demand by an urban and suburban population that lives nearby. And when they fill up, and I'll tell you, this is something I've observed personally. I was at Patapsco State Park this summer, and I got there early, right before actually they closed it to access. And on the way out, it was still one in, one out. And a lot of people had parked up into the towns in Howard County, or I guess we were in Baltimore County there. And then we're walking down the road. A lot of Latino people were walking down the road, carrying tubes, coolers, chairs, fishing rods, and they were walking into the park from underneath the bridge and walking up the stream valley. And that is, first of all, it's a massive safety hazard. People are walking down an 8-lane highway, with their beach gear. And then it's uncontrolled conservation access, right? People are walking in the stream bed up into the park however they want to go. So you've got this problem where, in this case, it's not that more land is needed necessarily, although it would be great if the park was bigger and there was more space, but a lot better facilities are needed and a lot better facility management. And like a train from Baltimore could make a huge difference, or a really frequent common bus system that is attractive to Spanish-speaking families. Some ways to get people there without running into the parking lot access being the major barrier. In this case, unlike Mariana, what you were telling me, it's not that people don't know it's there or that they can't reach it, because if there's 5 families that want to come, they obviously they pile into one car and they go, but then they may still not be able to get into the park. So I wonder if you could just speak to an example like that. How does that fit the America the Beautiful for All goals? Might there, for example, the groups who are working on park access in Maryland be able to roll up and join the campaign in some way? And help work with the state park system, which recognizes the problem but can only do so much on its own.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly right. And that is something that, as a coalition, there's definitely been conversations about. I don't have anything concrete because, again, we're working on the speed of trust and still having these conversations with our different work group members and leaders there. But yeah, today, for example, we also have a very similar kind of thinking about, right? It's not just about what we can conserve, but what is already there and how are we managing it. So when it comes to the ocean, we have these marine protected areas, that are really beautiful. Some of them are on the coastline, not a lot, and some of them are farther away. But there's not enough staff. There's not enough workforce to really, and even really great or updated management plans for these areas. And so how do we make sure that that's part of our asks and part of the solutions of making sure that we do have that we are thinking about, what about the spaces that we already have? How are they working? How are they not? Who are they serving? And, even thinking about, we're even thinking about a blueprint to really highlight all the public land, all the ocean, marine protected areas, and then kind of create a layer on top of that of who is it serving? What communities are there? And how are they accessing it, and who's missing, and what perspectives are missing there. And there's like I mentioned, there's already a lot of different campaigns out there, like Castor Range, like Chumash National Marine Sanctuary, which would be Chumash Heritage Site down southern California. And so there's already these kind of spaces there, but even the Chumash Heritage Site, it's more about protecting their heritage, their sacred spaces, than it is about protecting big ocean marine area. So just thinking about those different things and what does that mean and how do we get there? How do we make sure that Indigenous sovereignty is also part of the conversation? Private lands and private landowners are part of that conversation, or even what, public lands, or even marine protected areas where extraction is happening of oil and gas. And is that really what we want to be doing in those areas? So I think those are a lot of the different questions that we're asking ourselves and thinking as part of the solution. And I even thinking about equitable access to nature, I think there's so many different things that we can implement, from language access to website brochures, information panels in the sites, to thinking about multi-generational families. And, I know that when I go out with my grandma, I go out with my tias, I go out with my cousins, I go out with my little ones. So that's multi-general family, right? And how are the spaces, how are these nature spaces constructed to be able to have multi-generational families? Picnic areas, can they be longer? Can the pathways be longer? So really thinking about
We
those
had a
different
great
things.
conversation once with Lisa Garcia of Earth Justice, who was like, when I'm with my family, we're 20 people, and they want us to be at one picnic table, and then another family gets the other picnic table. But like she's like, when Latino families go to the park, we almost are going to they'd have to chain the picnic tables to the posts, or else we're going to move them. And then that's what they do. They chain them, and then we can't sit together. So yeah, it's a management issue of, do you really want a nuclear, is even down to your vision of who uses the parks and how? Is it just a nuclear family that can sit at one picnic table? Or do you need to make the flexibility that people could actually bring picnic tables together and sit with the 18, 20 people that are going to want to be there for a multi-generational picnic? Yeah.
Yeah, so those are all solutions, right? And even the word equitable access to nature, what does that really mean? And I can talk about my perspective as a Latina immigrant, but my perspective is going to be very different to Indigenous peoples, especially with their history. And it's going to be different for African Americans. It's going to be different for people with disabilities. It's going to be different for LGBTQ plus communities. And so I think it's also just remembering and constantly questioning who is not at the table, who needs to be at the table.
That makes me think of, you mentioned the cultural heritage landscapes, and that makes me think of something else we have in our region, which is that we have the landscape of Eastern Maryland. The Eastern Maryland shore is where Harriet Tubman was enslaved and then escaped, and then led her journeys, her Underground Railroad journeys from there. And we have there's a National Park Service designated cultural heritage landscape, I guess. I don't know exactly the wording for it, that traces out and tries to preserve some of the features along the route. But when I think about land and ocean being conserved, again, this is a slightly different question than what I asked before about the use of the space and sort of who gets to use it. But what types of land can be preserved, right? So if the landscape that's remaining of this cultural and natural landscape is farmland, mixed with scrubby invasive forest, mixed with sea level rise, and we manage to, let's say, protect it, more and more of it, in order from the motivations of both biological and cultural preservation, does that sort of count in the 30 by 30 framework, or does it not, because it's not in a very natural state, right? Like, if you're protecting a landscape that has many important cultural features, but it's being farmed, or it's been farmed for so long it's lost most of its topsoil, does that count?
Yeah, and this is my personal it's not the coalition talking here.
Sure.
I think it's like more of my personal perspective. I do believe that it does count, when it comes to even Latino heritage sites. There is of the 400 national parks out there, 24 of them are specifically preserving Latino, Latina, Latinx history. And to be quite honest with you, I feel like only one really speaks to it, where a lot of it is Hispanic, you know, colonization and churches and that kind of stuff. And so thinking about that, we just had Blackwell School, which was a segregated school for Latinos. I don't know my whole history there, but I'm not the public lands person. But you know, that is history, that is dark history, that, but it's also, you know, if we preserve it, we can think about how what harms have been done in the past and how we can mitigate them in the future. And I do believe that that can count towards the 30 by 30 goal, because it's not just about preserving lands, waters, and ocean. I believe that it also is about preserving our history and the intricacies of that history. And for many, many years, our whole history has not been told. And so I think that is something that we can do to mitigate and remediate the future and the present. And on top of that, I think that if we do preserve those spaces, there's an opportunity for restoration. Even thinking about, for example, in marine protected areas, and I know I keep referring back to that, but Monterey Bay has a really amazing history when it comes to how much extraction happened there, from otters being hunted almost to extinction, from whales being hunted for their blubbers almost to extinction, from when the otters were gone, sea urchins came in, they ate up all the kelp, which is that long algae on the bottom of the water. And that long algae is the baseline for the ecosystems underwater. So all the fish were gone. Abalone were fished, sardines were fished almost to near extinction. And it wasn't until there was some protections put into place and that we started to see those places thrive. And now if I go out on a boat, I can see whales, I can see dolphins, I can see seabirds, sea otters. I just saw some sea otters the other day. I can see the kelp forest that's on top of the water. And now it's a more of a beautiful connection, and you know, people are coming here to see these animals, to connect with nature. And it's also a fishing industry, and lots of fishing happens here. And so I think all to say that when we protect some of these spaces that have been extracted and you know, polluted, there is an opportunity to restore.
That's great. Yeah, that's a vision, right, for the future, to return and restore. So I have two questions for you in chat from our attendees, and Kathleen and Pat, if you'd like to ask them live, go ahead and raise your hand. And I'll wait a beat to see if you want to do that. And otherwise, I will just ask Mariana. Okay, I don't see hands go up, so I'll start with Pat's. And Pat has a very concrete, nose to the grindstone question here. What are the top 5 concrete measures that you want to accomplish in the near future? And you know, I know you're operating at the speed of trust, so you may not be able to answer that on behalf of the coalition for on the ground work, but even within the campaign, what are the top 5 things that you'd like to accomplish? Top few.
Yeah, I think even in just this administration, and I think we're still working on this, but I think top priorities that we want to accomplish. And if we're looking, I have a colleague that always asks this question: what is success here? How are we defining success? And so for us, I think it's number one, shifting the perspective, shifting the power, making sure that we are resourced to have the capacity for some of these organizations and community members to be able to be part of the decision making and the agenda setting for the next 2 years. I think putting out the policy agenda is another one. When it comes to our priority project campaigns, it's really thinking about what are some of those spaces, like the Chumash National Marine Sanctuary, like Castor Range, like Avi Wakame. What are some of these spaces that are ripe and ready to be out there, and how can we bring together all of the tables to be able to uplift and get some wins out of this administration. And then I think the other concrete success here would be to ensure that we are thinking ahead. And I think when the Trump administration came in, we weren't ready for that. And so it really held us back. And so how can we prepare for an administration that might not be as favorable to our goals? And so I think that's what success is at the moment. And, check back with me in January and I'll have some more concrete measures that we're looking at.
Thank you. So do you see Kathy Michael's question in the Q&A? I don't know. Regarding urban parks and play spaces, what is your understanding regarding plastic, synthetic turf, and tire rubber waste play spaces? These were explicitly mentioned as counting toward 30 by 30 by the Department of Interior officials for green spaces. Kathy, by the way, is part of a coalition called Safe and Healthy Playing Fields Incorporated, that's headquartered in our region but works nationwide. So, so she says doing so is essentially fake greening of urban parks, sports fields that actually further disadvantages children and increases urban heat stress, since these surfaces are hotter than asphalt. To adult eyes, they look nice, but functionally they are hot and toxic.
Yeah, I mean, plastic is one of those things that I work a lot on, and definitely agree with you on that. Plastic is something that's not just affecting wildlife, it's also affecting communities of color and frontline communities from extraction all the way to end of life. And we did see the Department of Interior put out a secretarial order to phase out single-use plastics in public lands and federally managed lands. So I think I agree with you on that. As far as the coalition goes, that is maybe something to bring up to our urban parks and green space work group to think about, and to see if we would want to put that in and be part of, our recommendations to the administration. And would love your expertise on that as well.
If you're willing to drop your email in the chat, Kathy, I'm sure we'll follow up and try to work with you in the urban work group leads. I have just one last question. And by the way, everybody, as you know, it's perfectly fine to end before 8:30 and let everyone go about their evenings, or in the case of a person in California, the end of their workday on time. So if you have any last questions, folks, please feel free to raise your hands or put them in the Q&A or chat. But here's my last question, and you've spoken about it a little bit, but I wanted to give you some time and space to reflect on your personal motivations for this work and your personal story. What does it mean to you to be working on national equitable access to nature and conservation in your life? What do you bring with you that's a powerful asset? What brings you joy to be doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, it's even hard hearing that. I was like, wow, I'm doing that. Interesting. No, but I think for me, as someone that came here with my family from Mexico, and have seen and lived through many different traumatic events in my life, and partially because of my status. I think it's something that, thinking about my future, and what really got me started here, I became a young mom at 17 with my little one, who's now 13 years old. And so for me, it was always making sure that her future, and it's still that she has a future to look forward to, where, climate's not going to impact her as much, where she's going to be able to go out into these nature spaces and feel welcomed and feel like she belongs. And so number one motivator is my pollitos, it's my 2 little ones, and it's providing and making sure that they have an equitable and just future. And I think overall my community and comunidad and my Latino heritage and really has inspired me to make sure that we are in these spaces unafraid and unapologetic, and really thinking about the health and the future of all communities that have historically intentionally been overlooked and have and still are dealing with environmental injustices. So that's what motivates me, what brings me joy. And I think in general, just, every time I step near the ocean, every time I step into nature and conserved areas, it's a time of solace. It's a time of washing away, hard days, and I just want everyone to have that same experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank
If
you.
you ever
Thank you
come
all.
back to the DC area and you have some time, I know that you're always probably very, very busy when you're here, but people sometimes don't realize that we have spectacular landscapes. They're just not very tall. You can't see them from far away. And I think all of us here, and I certainly would be very happy to give you a tour of some of our beautiful favorite natural spaces.
Oh, thank you. Yes, definitely will do. And thank you, Kathleen. I see your information. I will copy and paste.
Well, with that, I think we can just go ahead and wrap up. First of all, just another huge thank you, Mariana. Thank you so much for bringing us some of your time here at the very tail end or afterwards of Hispanic Heritage Month, which I know is a busy time for everyone at GreenLatinos. We really appreciate you. It's a good fit. This actually was in your workday rather than in the evening, so I'm pleased that we could offer that with a West Coaster.
Yes.
For me, it's after dinner and kid bedtime. So thank you, and thank you to everyone for coming. We know we have other people who registered will receive the recording. We hope you enjoy this recording when you're watching it. And I want to make sure to give a plug for our next Conservation Cafe, the last one of the fall, which I am also really excited about, and is going to be a special and unique cafe for us. Someone who I am honored to be getting to know, Elder Rico Newman of the Chaptico Band of Piscataway Canoy in our region in Maryland, is going to teach us about a land acknowledgement. And you heard Mariana give a brief land acknowledgement for the place where she lives and is standing. In our region, we might acknowledge the unceded land of the Piscataway who are still here, and the Nacotchtanks who are not. And we, when we give these kinds of land acknowledgements, we can be brief like that, or we can be a lot longer. There's a lot we can say because it's really a blessing of the land and the people who are its traditional caretakers. And Elder Rico Newman is really good at giving land acknowledgements. He's happy to do so with non-Indigenous people and to talk with us about what it means to do a good one, what you should not do, who gets to do one, under what circumstances should you do them. And I think it's just going to be a really, really wonderful teaching. So I hope you all will join us and spread the word. It's going to be at the same time, 7 o'clock Eastern, and he's going to speak personally from his experience here in this region. But Mariana, if you know anybody, nationwide who would be interested in this talk, I'd encourage you to share it with them as well. Like all our talks, we request that those who can afford to pay a fee of $10 or $15, and we have a complimentary option available to those who cannot. And with that, I thank you all. This will be, I believe, the last Conservation Cafe of Audubon Naturalist Society. Stay tuned to find out what we will be called during our next Conservation Cafe. Tomorrow is the big day of the big name change. So thank you all for joining us today. Mariana, if you'd like to add anything.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Be well. Have a great evening. Oh, wait, Mariana, make sure you drop the link if people can donate to the campaign. You said you needed funds to provide stipends to partner groups. Is there a donate link you can put in there?
There is not, but feel free to email me.
Okay. good to
Yes.
know. Email
Thank you.
Mariana if you'd like to contribute in any way to the funding for the campaign. Okay. Buenas noches a todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.